What if I told you that some of the world's deadliest wars, some of the most unstable governments, some of the bloodiest revolutions, and even the rise of modern terrorism could all be traced back to one secret meeting, one map, one deal, a deal so powerful that more than 100 years later, the entire Middle East is still living inside its shadow. This is the story of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secret agreement signed during World War I, an agreement that carved up entire civilizations. Without asking a single person who actually lived there, two men sitting in Europe used rulers to draw borders across deserts they had never walked. They divided tribes, they divided religions, they divided languages, and they created countries that millions of people would later fight and die over. The craziest part? Most people today have never even heard of it. But once you understand what happened here, you start realizing something terrifying. The modern Middle East was not naturally created, it was engineered, and the consequences never stopped. Tonight, we are going back to the collapse of empires, secret diplomacy, oil, colonial greed, betrayal, revolutions, and the invisible lines that still control millions of lives today. Because the Middle East we know now was born from one of the most important secret deals in human history, and almost nobody saw it coming. To understand the Middle East today, we have to go back to an empire that ruled for over 600 years, the Ottoman Empire. At its height, the Ottomans controlled huge parts of Europe, North Africa, and nearly the entire Middle East. This was not a small kingdom. This was one of the greatest empires on earth. Istanbul became one of the most important cities in the world. Trade routes flowed through Ottoman territory. Religious centers like Mecca and Jerusalem were under Ottoman control. And for centuries, the empire survived wars, rebellions, invasions, and political chaos. But by the early 1900s, the empire was weakening. European powers called it the sick man of Europe. Its economy was collapsing. Nationalist movements were growing, internal corruption spread everywhere, and powerful countries in Europe were waiting like vultures. Britain, France, Russia, Germany. They all saw opportunity, especially because the Middle East was becoming strategically priceless. Trade routes, the Suez Canal, and something else that would soon change global power forever: oil. At this point, the modern world was beginning to run on petroleum, navies, factories, machines, cars. War itself was changing, and whoever controlled oil could control the future. The British especially understood this, because the British Empire depended on global naval dominance, and naval dominance depended on fuel. So when massive oil reserves were discovered in the Middle East, every major power started paying attention. Then came the event that changed everything: World War I. In 1914, the world descended into industrial-scale war. The Ottoman Empire joined Germany and the Central Powers. Britain and France suddenly saw the Ottoman territories as enemy land, and behind closed doors, they started planning something enormous. Not just victory, partition. They weren't thinking about how to save the region. They were thinking about how to divide it, even before the war ended. That is where our story truly begins. In 1915 and 1916, while millions of soldiers were dying in trenches, two men met in secret: Sir Mark Sykes of Britain and François-Georges Picot of France. These men were diplomats, strategists, empire builders. And together, they were about to redraw the Middle East. Not publicly, not democratically, secretly. The agreement they negotiated would later become known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Its goal was simple. If the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Britain and France would divide its Arab territories between themselves, like pieces on a chessboard. France would dominate areas that would later become Syria and Lebanon. Britain would control Iraq and influence areas near Palestine and Jordan. Russia was also promised territory, entire civilizations reduced to colored zones on paper. And the people living there, they were never consulted, not once. Tribal regions were split apart. Ancient communities were separated. Religious populations were mixed into unstable political structures. The map ignored reality, but to colonial powers, that didn't matter. The real priorities were power, trade, and strategic control. Think about this. Many of the borders you see on today's maps were drawn by foreign officials over 100 years ago. Straight lines cutting through deserts. No regard for culture, no regard for ethnic history, no regard for future consequences. And while this secret agreement was being signed, Britain was making another promise, a completely different promise, to the Arabs, and that contradiction would explode into one of the greatest betrayals in modern history. While Britain and France secretly planned to divide the Middle East, Britain needed help defeating the Ottomans. So British officials reached out to Arab leaders, most importantly, Sharif Hussein of Mecca. The British promised something massive. If Arab forces revolted against the Ottoman Empire, they would support Arab independence after the war. To many Arab leaders, this sounded like freedom, a chance to build an independent Arab nation. So the Arab revolt began. Tribal fighters launched attacks across the desert. Ottoman railways were sabotaged. British officers like T.E. Lawrence, later known as Lawrence of Arabia, became legendary figures. Together, they fought against the Ottoman Empire. Thousands died believing they were fighting for independence. But behind the scenes, Britain had already signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, meaning the promises being made to Arab leaders were never fully real. The region had already been secretly divided. Imagine risking everything for freedom, only to discover your future had already been sold. That betrayal would leave scars that still exist today. Then in 1917, everything became even more explosive. Because another promise entered the picture, the Balfour Declaration. Now Britain had effectively made overlapping promises. Promises to Arabs, promises to Zionist leaders, and secret deals with France. Three different political visions. One region, no clear solution. The stage was now set for generations of conflict, and nobody yet understood how catastrophic the consequences would become. World War I finally ended in 1918, and the Ottoman Empire collapsed. One of history's greatest empires was gone. Britain moved quickly, France moved quickly. They took control of former Ottoman territories through something called the Mandate System. Officially, these mandates were supposed to prepare regions for self-government. But many people saw them for what they really were, colonial control under a different name. France took Syria. France took Lebanon. Britain gained Iraq. Britain gained Transjordan. Britain gained Palestine. And suddenly, new countries appeared. Countries that had never existed in this form before. Iraq combined Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, Kurds under one political system. Syria became fragmented. Lebanon was structured around sectarian divisions. Palestine became increasingly unstable. The borders looked clean on maps, but reality on the ground was far more complicated. Resistance began almost immediately. In Iraq, there were uprisings against British rule. In Syria, French forces crushed revolts. Nationalist anger spread everywhere because people understood something important. They had not truly become free. They had simply moved from Ottoman control to European control, and the resentment grew deeper every year. But another force was rising too: oil. And oil would transform the entire region into one of the most strategically important places on Earth. As the 20th century continued, the Middle East became the center of global energy. Massive oil fields ignite across deserts, pipelines slice through dunes, neon-lit refineries, boardrooms of Anglo-American oil executives, petrodollars flowing. Oil reserves discovered in Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and surrounding regions changed everything. Superpowers became deeply involved in Middle Eastern politics. Governments rose and fell. Coups happened. Foreign intelligence agencies intervened. Military alliances formed, because controlling the Middle East increasingly meant controlling global energy. And many of the fragile borders created after World War I were now sitting on top of enormous wealth. But wealth did not create stability. In many places, it intensified division. Different ethnic groups competed for power. Religious tensions deepened. Colonial systems left behind weak institutions. Authoritarian governments emerged, and outside powers kept interfering. Coups unfolding, strongmen saluting from balconies, oil money, buying influence, Cold War cables, parades of missiles, street protests, masked agents at night. Then came the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union both wanted influence in the Middle East. Suddenly, the region became one of the world's biggest geopolitical battlegrounds. Wars erupted. Israel and neighboring Arab states fought repeated conflicts. Palestinian displacement created generations of trauma. Revolutions transformed governments. Iran experienced political upheaval. Iraq became militarized. Syria hardened into authoritarian rule. And underneath all of it, those old artificial borders remained. The lines drawn during Sykes-Picot never disappeared. Instead, they became pressure points. And eventually, some groups began openly rejecting the entire system. In the early 2000s, the Middle East entered another era of chaos. The Iraq War destabilized the region. Sectarian violence exploded. Power vacuums emerged, and extremist organizations gained territory. One group in particular made something very clear: ISIS. They openly declared that the borders created after World War I were illegitimate. In propaganda videos, ISIS fighters destroyed border checkpoints between Iraq and Syria. They called it the end of Sykes-Picot. Think about how powerful that is. A secret agreement signed in 1916 was still shaping conflicts a century later. Entire wars were still connected to those original divisions. Millions of refugees, civil wars, foreign interventions, religious conflict, ethnic fragmentation. The ghost of Sykes-Picot never vanished. Now, this does not mean every modern conflict was caused solely by one agreement. History is more complicated than that. Corruption, authoritarianism, global intervention, economic inequality, religious extremism, all of these played enormous roles. But the Sykes-Picot Agreement helped create the foundation. It shaped borders. It shaped governments. It shaped power struggles. And it created unresolved tensions that future generations inherited. The agreement became more than just a map. It became a symbol. a symbol of foreign powers deciding the future of millions of people without their consent. And for many across the Middle East, that memory never disappeared. Here is the twist almost nobody talks about. The Sykes-Picot map itself was never fully implemented exactly as originally designed. The final borders changed over time. New negotiations happened, wars altered territories, political movements reshaped governments. So why does Sykes-Picot still matter so much? Because it represented the beginning of a new system. A system where outside powers believed they could redesign entire regions from above. And once that process started, it never truly stopped. Foreign intervention became normalized. Maps became political weapons, and local populations often paid the price. Even today, the Middle East remains one of the most strategically contested regions on Earth. Global powers still compete there. Military bases still expand there. Energy politics still dominate there. Many borders remain politically fragile. The shadow continues. What makes this story so important is not just the past. It is the warning. Because history shows us something dangerous. When powerful nations redraw societies for strategic gain, the consequences can last for generations. Sometimes centuries, and often, the people who suffer most are the ones who never had a voice in the decision. Today, more than 100 years after the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Middle East is still searching for stability. Some countries succeeded in building stronger systems. Others remain trapped in cycles of conflict. But across the region, history is still alive. Not as ancient memory, but as political reality. And maybe the most important lesson is this. Maps are never just lines. Borders are never just borders. They shape identity, power, resources, religion, security, and human lives. A line drawn in one generation can create consequences for the next 100 years. That is the true power of Sykes-Picot. Not just the agreement itself, but the chain reaction it unleashed. And once you see it, you start noticing something incredible. History is never really over. The past keeps echoing into the present, sometimes louder than anyone expects. One secret agreement, two diplomats, a few lines drawn across a map, and more than a century later, the world is still living with the consequences. The Sykes-Picot Agreement did not create every conflict in the Middle East, but it helped shape the modern political landscape more than almost any other secret deal in history. And understanding it changes how you see the world. Because behind many modern headlines, there are old maps, old decisions, old empires, still casting shadows. If you made it to the end of this documentary, you now understand one of the most important geopolitical stories most people never learn. So here is the question. Do you think the modern Middle East could ever have become stable after borders were drawn this way? Or was conflict inevitable from the beginning? Comment below. And if you want more deep cinematic documentaries about hidden history, global power empires' secret strategies, the forces shaping our world, subscribe now, because the next story might explain the future. Fade to black.